Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. I'm joined today by someone I always have fun talking with. He is Paul Poast. He is a Dr. Paul Poast, Professor Paul Poast. He is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and the Committee on International Relations at the University of Chicago. He's a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And let me just do your CV a little bit there, Paul. He received his PhD from the University of Michigan, his master's from the London School of Economics, and his political science BA was from Miami University. He's the author or co-author, and I'm reading this from your bio, the author or co-author of 3 books, The Economics of War, which we're definitely going to be talking about, Organizing Democracy, and Arguing About Alliances. We're going to talk about all 3 of those. Paul, when last you and I spoke, I don't know if it was just before Russia invaded Ukraine or after the invasion, but let's talk about, 1 year out. What do we know now that we didn't know then?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's really a pleasure. It's always fun chatting with you. And I think one way to answer that question is just to quickly recap how we got to here, right?
Please.
What has happened over the past year. So obviously literally a year ago last week was when Russia invaded Ukraine. And it took some people by surprise, but I think a lot of people who were very closely watching the situation expected an invasion. I do think, however, that even people who expected the invasion, myself included, were surprised by the extent of the invasion, right? I think a lot of us were expecting something more limited, maybe an incursion into the eastern provinces. I think a lot of people were surprised by the fact that it seemed like Putin was authorizing the use of force throughout the entire country to try to conquer the entire country of Ukraine. And of course, that's what happened a year ago at this time. And really, you can kind of think about the past year as going through 3 phases. So the first phase, I would label as the Crimean model of Russia following what would be called the Crimean model. What I mean by that is if you go back to 2014, when Russia took control of the Crimean Peninsula, they did so in a lightning strike, a lightning operation that resulted in no casualties. It was just simply sending forces quickly into the territory, taking control of it. We call that a fait accompli. That basically look, we have the high ground, if you will, and now you can't take it. And my sense is that they thought they could do the same thing, but at scale. And so that's why the operation was carried out in the way it was back in February of 2022. But of course, Ukraine started to fight back against that. And as a result, you started to see over the next few months, the Russian strategy switch from the Crimean model to what you could call the Chechnya model. And this is in reference to basically the exact opposite. If the Crimean model is based on a lightning strike where there's minimal casualties and basically almost no use of force by the military, just simply acquiring it, taking it, and then demanding that the other try to take it back, the Chechnya model is the opposite. It is about indiscriminate use of violence against civilian locations. It is a strategy predicated on punishment is what it's about. And
how dare you fight back? Yeah.
How dare you fight back? And you could see where the Russian strategy started to switch to that, of starting to use more of the Chechnya model. This is where you saw the missile strikes just kind of almost seeming to just indiscriminately go anywhere they could, just as long as they were causing damage and causing punishment. And that was essentially where the second stage moved in. The third stage then started in the fall, and that was following the major offensive that Ukrainian forces launched in September. And this was, of course, enabled by a lot of the armaments that Ukraine was receiving over the past several months from Western countries and notably NATO allies. Those armaments, combined with assistance and planning, allowed the Ukrainian forces to engage in a major offensive that started to put Russia on the back foot. That then led to, of course, a response by Russia, which was mobilization of forces. And that is essentially the third phase, and we are still in that third phase, where you had this push by Ukraine, enabled by a lot of armaments from the West. You have a response by Russia, pulling in even more forces to where there are now more forces there are more Russian forces in Ukraine now than there were at the start of the invasion. And so you are kind of in this stalemate situation where there's now kind of the movement of offensive, counteroffensive, minor offensive, winter offensives, potentially a spring offensive. But we're starting to move into a situation that looks in many ways analogous to the Western Front of World War I, where you have kind of a stasis. You have efforts to try to move that line. Those efforts might succeed to a limited extent, but then stall. That is kind of the situation that we're in now. And that really does set the stage for then thinking about what we could be witnessing over the next year.
Look, I want to come back to that because I've got all kinds of questions. Let me ask you this. How much of Russia's military forces are committed to this? I mean, understanding that they can't wage naval warfare against Ukraine, but how much of Russia's forces are committed to this?
So it's a great question in terms of trying to get a good sense of kind of a couple angles to this. So first of all, the one angle is to say how much of their forces, actual trained pre-invasion forces, are actually dedicated to that. And I can't give an exact percentage to that. But what we do know is the beginning of the invasion took place with a little over 100,000 forces. Sure. And again, and that is, of course, not enough to actually conquer a country the size of Ukraine unless you think that it's going to be carried out very quickly and easily as the Crimea model would be based on. Now what we're looking at is about 300,000 Russian forces in Ukraine. Now, not all of those are from the actual pre-invasion forces. Of course, there's been this call up that has been happening of bringing in more people from the Russian population, recruitment in that way. You also have and I think this has received quite a bit of attention, kind of, if you will, the hiring of mercenaries, bringing in forces from Syria, from other countries. And so the force is not the same force that necessarily would have been in existence at the beginning of it, but is now more of this amalgam of some pre-invasion forces, some new recruits, and then also individuals who are kind of these mercenaries that wouldn't have even been affiliated with Russia prior to the war. And so that's kind of the force that you're seeing now. Of course, the other thing in terms of thinking about the kind of resources that Russia is now using, as has been very well known, a lot of major generals that were in there have been killed over the past year.
Sure. But
at the same time, where the nature of the fighting now, and I was saying this to somebody the other day, I was saying, you got to keep in mind that the nature of the fighting now is not the type of like high-end tactical strategic type planning that you need to have, say, at the beginning of an invasion. It is now, because of going back to what I was saying, it's now much more about just holding territory.
Sure.
And if you're holding territory, to be honest, it's much simpler, right? It's not easy, but it's simple in terms of what the objectives are. And so even if you're now working with a force that is maybe not as well trained as the force that you would have been coming in with, it's also a much simpler operation.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the overall state of where Russian forces are right now.
I want to get back to the origins of this, and I've got a question I want to ask to sort of see if I need to issue a mea culpa. But let's talk about this. Since we're at what is essentially a stalemate, akin to the Western Front of World War I, let's talk about the role of the Chinese and the overtures by the Chinese government and how that might change things, whether or not it's in terms of supplying the Russians, whether or not it's in terms of brokering a peace agreement, which I don't think that they want to do. And much later on, I want to talk about what this all looks like and the various debates about that. But China's interjection of their viewpoint into this, how does that change the calculus?
Absolutely. So China is indeed a major factor here.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because of the role that they could play, analogous to what the Western countries have been playing for Ukraine. As was very famously said by President Zelensky near the beginning of the war, and of course, it's not clear, did he exactly say it this way or not, but of course everybody says it as such now, which is, I don't need a ride, I need ammo. Right? Yeah. And that was the idea, that I do not need assistance by the Western countries to leave the country, to have a government exile. I instead need weapons. Right. We need that.
Yes.
And that is indeed what the Western countries have been providing. And as much as it is important to laud the efforts by the Ukrainian forces, to laud the resolve of the Ukrainian people, they would not be able to achieve what they've achieved without the Western assistance,
100%.
the weaponry
Agreed.
that's been going to them. Why that's relevant is because, on the one hand, Russia, of course, is a much larger country, much larger military than Ukraine. So on the one hand, they have the resources to be able to do a lot of this on their own. But as the war drags on, and when you couple this with, and I'm sure this is something we'll be talking about more as we're going along, but if you couple this with the economic harm that's been done by Western sanctions, then it's important for Russia to be able to have some alternative resources, to be able to have something beyond themselves that they can turn to. And that's where China comes in. Now, the role that China has been playing so far is very similar to the role that other countries have been playing, which is to take essentially a diplomatic, non-committal position, or to even express flat-out neutrality in this, but be more than happy to continue to purchase, say, Russian energy. So this is not just China. We've seen this with India. We've seen this with Brazil. You could think about it, the organization that Russia is part of, the BRICS, right, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. Those countries have been assisting Russia, at least in the extent of not flatly condemning Russia, but also being willing to continue to buy Russian energy, which of course is something that the West cut off from itself. And that is something that's helped Russia. Where China could be coming in is continuing to do that.
Paul, wait a minute. Let me stick a pin in that for a second, because it's a perfect segue into my question, because I want to come back to this. So please, let's do that, and please remind me of that. But one of the great problems that I have right now is that, the U.S. has not been stepping up in terms of its own energy production to essentially flood the market and bottom out the price of petroleum. Keeping petroleum prices high, at least in my estimation, helps Russia because they can sell their oil to the BRICS countries at much higher prices and thus fund their war machine. What are your thoughts on that?
So this is absolutely part of the overall strategy, or at least the idea behind using the sanctions, right?
Yeah.
The thing to think about sanctions is they're fully based on the idea of self-harm, right? That I believe, the idea behind the sanctions is that I believe so strongly in a policy that I am willing to do economic harm to myself in order to achieve that policy objective, or more specifically to get you to change your behavior. And that is indeed what the Western countries have been doing. But the problem is, and as you point out, is that Russia has still been able to continue to sell their oil. They haven't, of course, they're not selling it to the Western Europeans at the same level that they were, but they have been able to turn to alternative resources, alternative markets. Now, what's interesting is those alternative markets have been doing this in a way that very much serves their interest. So India, China in particular have said, we are more than happy to continue to buy Russian oil, but we want to do it at bargain prices. And so even though oil prices would be high, they've been able to purchase them at a lower price. Now, of course, if oil prices were to fall even further, that would further lower the price that Russia could sell for. And, we could even get into how that absolutely would do a lot more harm to the Russian economy. But until that happens, this has allowed Russia to continue on, if you will, and to mitigate the type of harm that could have been done by the economic sanctions. And one good indicator of the lack of harm, if you will, is that recently the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, along with Levada, which is an institute in Russia that works on polling, and the Chicago Council works a lot with doing polling. And what they found from a poll is they polled Russians about what kind of hardship are you experiencing because of the sanctions. Now, you could say some of this might be propaganda, some of this might be wishful thinking, but even then that still matters. But what was interesting was nearly 80% of the respondents at most said there was like mild discomfort due to economic discomfort due to the sanctions. Now, again, maybe they're lying, maybe they're this, but the point is that at least publicly they're expressing, the sanctions aren't really doing much to us. So I think that this is the angle to be thinking about this issue.
All right, let's come back to what you were saying about China. So we've got this, we've established they're buying the oil. Talk about what the other parts of how China can get involved in this.
Yeah, so up till now, of course, we've been talking about the oil purchasing part, which of course is very significant. But what's become, at least now on the table, what's become more relevant and potentially would be indeed a game changer would be if China were to switch from just simply providing, if you will, diplomatic cover and simply being willing to buy Russian oil at bargain prices to actually becoming a co-belligerent in the war. Now, this would not be the level of China, providing soldiers. They're not going to send, China's soldiers are not going to be going there. The People's Liberation Army is not going to be moving into Ukraine. But could they be providing military aid? Could they be providing financing that would allow Russia to be able to continue to fund its war machine? Could they be providing weaponry, the type of technology? Because this is one thing that Russia has been harmed by with the sanctions is the inability to be able to access certain high-end technology from the West that previously they would have had. Could China step in to provide that? And that is, of course, something that just in the past week, there's been a lot of back and forth about, that U.S. intelligence sources have very credible information that China was thinking about this. Of course, China's government has flat out denied this.
Sure.
But, of course, they're going to deny it. Just like they denied that the balloon that we were all talking about a few weeks ago was actually a surveillance balloon, even though it was pretty obvious it was, right? So this is the state of things right now. And if China were to do that, it very much would change the entire complexion of how this war looks.
All right. I want to get into the history of this. I want to talk about some of the theories that are involved, but I want to ask you. This is going to be completely out of left field. So in 2014, after Crimea was invaded, a lot of folks, myself included, were very critical of the response to the Obama administration, and I penned a piece for the National Review, which was very controversial in certain international relations circles because I called for the sighting of U.S. troops on Ukrainian soil in and around Kyiv, but out of the eastern region, but at least situated in Ukraine as a hedge against possible Russian aggression down the road. And I came in for, and I accept this criticism, right? You never want to commit U.S. troops unless you're willing to sacrifice those troops. I understand that totally, but the idea was, well, we have had troops on the Korean Peninsula for 60 years. This has served as a bulwark. The North Koreans are never going to invade South Korea so long as U.S. troops are there. And this was the model I was going for. And again, feel free to tell me I was wrong. Because I'm someone who has gone back and forth about this. Would the presence of U.S. troops outside of the Donbass region long before, 2014 and beyond, could it have prevented this war from taking place?
I don't think that claim is off base at all.
All right.
And the reason why is, first of all, because of the example you cited. The Korean Peninsula is a great example of this, and indeed that has been a key component of U.S. foreign policy in East Asia since the beginning of the Cold War, has been the presence of U.S. troops, not just in the Korean Peninsula, but also, of course, bases in Japan. Sure. To a limited extent, and it's always kind of vague, the extent, in Taiwan. Of course, they're just trainers and so forth. But, of course, just slightly over the horizon in Guam, and, U.S. presence in that region is being kind of based on, or the idea being that by the U.S. having a presence there that serves as a deterrent to aggression. But the key is that it's not just enough to have U.S. presence or NATO presence over the horizon, if you will. What we mean by that is, yes, they could quickly come in if they need to. The key for deterrence is what you're talking about, which is that you actually have to have the forces there to stop a lightning strike of the type that Russia tried to execute. Yes. This is actually an argument that myself and Dan Ryder, who's at Emory University, we made this argument in a piece that we published in the Texas National Security Review that was published in 2021 about the idea of forward deployed forces and about how if you're going to use them, the way that you achieve peace with them is not having a small force that we would call a tripwire, but instead you have to have a large force, one that is actually able to stop something like what happened in Crimea or what Russia tried. Because the idea is that the adversary says, well, we're just trying to do this quickly. And so we don't care if you are credible in sending assistance. We don't care if you're credible in terms of eventually 3 weeks from now you'll have troops there. We think we're going to have this thing done in 3 days. So unless those troops are already there, they're not going to deter. Any type of credible commitment or credible promise to send aid is not going to deter if you think that you can actually, if you will, achieve the high ground or solidify your position within days. So I actually do agree with this. Now,
thank you.
The key, you're welcome. The one key question would be, of course, would have been politically viable. That's always the key thing. Could the U.S. have stationed a large contingent of troops in Ukraine, given that Ukraine was not a NATO country, right? It's one thing to have U.S. troops in the Baltics, which of course we do, or in Poland, which of course we do. And this was all part of a shift that NATO made and the U.S. made following the Crimean Peninsula being taken in 2014, which was something we call the enhanced forward presence, which was putting more and more NATO troops and U.S. troops further east, but still doing so on NATO territory, not doing so in non-NATO territory. Having said that, though, I think that the U.S. could have done more short of troops. They could have provided more arms ahead of time, for example.
Well, actually, yes, certainly I agree with that. I mean, I guess one of my theses in all this, and I'm glad that I would not have been laughed out of your classroom had I been in your class. We talk about NATO and our NATO obligations, but of course we have the obligations under the 1994 treaty, in terms of what now, again, I got into a deep and abiding discussion with my Soviet studies professor about just what that treaty obligated us to, because I'm still very close to her. But again, these are, at least to me, that was part of the cover that I thought we would have is we told Ukraine, or we asked Ukraine to give up your weapons. If you give up your weapons, we agree to protect you. By the way, but talk about this. There is debate over just what that treaty obligates us to, whether or not that treaty was superseded down the road. Talk to us about that.
Absolutely. So what you're referring to is the Budapest Memorandum.
That's it.
And that was signed, of course, in 1994. And the idea behind that was going back to the very collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, the full context here, though I'm sure your listeners know this, is, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
But the key thing was, it wasn't just that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union. It's that a large portion of the Soviet nuclear arsenal was on Ukrainian territory. So when Ukraine became independent, they suddenly found themselves in possession of all of these nuclear weapons. The question became what to do with them and how they should be used. And this became a priority for the Clinton administration in the United States, as well as the Yeltsin administration in Russia, was to try to figure out a solution of what to do with these, because there was concerns about proliferation in general, just more countries having these. And of course, Ukraine wasn't the only one. Kazakhstan also had these. Uzbekistan had these weapons as well, but the bulk of them were in Ukraine. And so the question was, what should we do about this? Now, there was an argument being made at the time that Ukraine should keep them. And that the reason why they should keep them is because of what we're witnessing now. That there was very much a belief in Ukraine. There was a belief in the Baltic states, all of the former Soviet republics, especially the ones that all were on the eastern side that were more had desires to quickly declare independence from the Soviet Union, also viewed that Russia would eventually become aggressive again. And so the question was what to do about that. Now, in the case of the Baltic states, they immediately sought NATO membership. They were like, we want to be part of NATO. In the case of Ukraine, NATO maybe wasn't quite on the table, but they also had a large nuclear stockpile. So it's like, well, maybe we can use these as a deterrent. Of course, there were questions about could they actually use them, because the launch codes, everything like that was actually in Moscow. And so it's like, well, they don't have operational control of these. However, maybe they could have been a bargaining chip.
Right.
Or maybe through Western assistance, they could have been armed and used, right? I mean, there were a lot of potential things on the table. Ultimately, though, what was done was in 1994, there was an agreement reached between Russia, United States, Ukraine, and a few other countries as well, France, Britain, where they agreed to have Ukraine give up their arsenal, give it back to Russia, in exchange for Russia, the United States, and these other countries honoring this territorial integrity of Ukraine. And that was the agreement reached. Now, of course, we can look at it now and we can say, well, that agreement was not honored by Russia at all, because going back to even 2014, they didn't honor this. However, that to take it back to what you were saying, on the one hand, that does absolutely put the U.S. in a position to try to assist Ukraine. Say, look, we made a commitment to defend the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and we're going to do that. On the other hand, that's still where placing troops on Ukraine's territory gets dicey, because then you could say, well, now the U.S. is not honoring its promise to not violate territorial integrity of Ukraine, because you're now putting U.S. forces there. And of course, this is where it gets into a little bit of vagueness of like, well, what if they're invited in and so on and so forth.
Right.
But you can see where that's another complicating thing, is that on the one hand, the U.S. would be in a position to defend, but putting U.S. troops there could be interpreted as the U.S. itself actually violating that agreement.
So let's cast it back a little bit. Actually, before we cast back to talk about Euromaidan and the history here, let's talk about, we've been talking about forward deployed forces. We've been talking about Poland, the Baltic states, and U.S. troops on the ground there, or U.S. forces on the ground there. Let's talk about your colleague John Mearsheimer and the Mearsheimer theory. And I don't even think I want to talk about the Third Rome theory, because I think, actually, before we get to Mearsheimer, I think we pretty much now understand that the perspective that this is really about Putin wanting to do what's right by the Russian Orthodox Church and sort of the Third Rome, which is what we call the Third Rome theory, or part of what we call the Third Rome theory, that's hogwash, right? I think nobody really accepts that this is what he wanted to do, right?
I think that's right. I think that the idea, well, I would say that's right to the extent to where you could argue that there's some sort of like deep religious type of perception or drive for this, or kind of, development of the Third Rome, or trying to do right by the Russian Orthodox Church or so forth. I think that I don't think there's as much support for that.
Sure.
However, what there is support for, and would be related to this, is the notion that Putin is focused on trying to reestablish the Russian Empire, right?
Yes.
And so in that sense, there is a lot of validity to it. Putin himself has likened himself to Peter the Great. And so this is, and so we're talking about not just reestablishing the Soviet Empire, but even reestablishing the Russian Empire. And of course, Ukraine has always been viewed as central to that. And so, yes, I do think that there's a lot to be said for that idea, that this is ultimately the big thing that's driving Putin.
All right, so now let's get it. So your colleague, John Mearsheimer, he's written extensively about this, is the darling... I'm not going to cast aspersions on this. What he is, let's speak about what he's written, and the fact that there are folks who are very much, well, I don't necessarily call them Russian apologists, but let's say that they are Ukraine skeptics, who believe that this is, and Mearsheimer's written about this, that this is in no small measure the result. This conflict is in no small measure the result of NATO aggression, NATO expansion. By the way, folks, following Paul, I regret that I don't remember your Twitter handle offhand, but you should follow Paul on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle?
It's at Prof. Paul Poast.
At Prof. Paul Poast, P-O-A-S-T, by the way. It is so worth following in terms of these extended threads that are just fantastic in terms of laying out these issues. But talk about your esteemed colleague, John Mearsheimer. I mean, he's written about this, but you disagree. I agree with you. I disagree with him on this. Talk about the issue of whether or not this is all the result of NATO's provocative actions over the years.
Absolutely, yes, and thank you for bringing up my Twitter handle, and yes, that hopefully can be another source for your listeners to kind of gain information about this and about all sorts of issues on international affairs. So in terms of John, and indeed on Twitter, I have made very public that I disagree with John on these issues. So first of all, let me just say that John is my senior colleague here at the University of Chicago, and he and I have a very good professional relationship.
Right.
He's a very good colleague. So I want to say that to start off with.
And this is why I wanted to make sure we weren't casting aspersions on Professor Mearsheimer, because he is esteemed. He's done great. He is very learned in this. He just happens to be, in my estimation, wrong. But go ahead.
Yes, that's exactly right. And so, I always preface it with that it's like, I disagree with him, but I do have respect for him as a colleague and as a professional. So his argument has been, since really about the time of the Crimean Peninsula, is in 2014. And in fact, in 2014, he wrote an article that was published in Foreign Affairs titled, "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault," right? Or something like that. It's essentially the title. And obviously the title says it all, right? It's like the crisis in Ukraine, and then now by extension, the war in Ukraine is completely the fault of the West. And the idea behind this argument is that Russia is simply fighting a defensive war. They are simply pushing back against the aggression that the Western countries in NATO have placed upon and have been putting upon Russia. Now, what is that aggression? The aggression that John would argue is the idea of NATO expansion. And that since the end of the Cold War, the NATO, of course, expanded first into Central Europe, then into Eastern Europe, and ultimately into former Soviet republics, such as the Baltic states, right? And his argument is that this was the U.S. pushing this and doing so in a way to try to take advantage of Russian weakness. And of course, doing so in a way that would then trigger Russia to perceive this as a threat. And what would be the natural thing for someone to do when they perceive a threat coming closer and closer to their border? Well, that is to lash out, right? And that is essentially his argument. His argument. There's several problems with this argument. Now, that's like the overarching view of this argument. He then goes into further details that are also questionable in terms of 2014, whether it was a coup and all these things. And of course, these are things that he claims that we're not going to get into those specific details of what he tries to argue. But that's the essence of the argument. And what I have pointed out is that, first of all, that gets the facts wrong in terms of NATO expansion. And I already hinted at this earlier when I was talking about the Baltic states. So Absolutely. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Eastern European countries, and in particular the former Soviet republics, they expected Russia to become aggressive again. Yes. And they were the ones who wanted NATO membership. It was not the U.S. pushing NATO membership on anybody. And in fact, the Clinton administration was very dubious about the idea of NATO eventually expanding all the way to the former Soviet republics. There's a video, you can find this clip of Joe Biden on YouTube. You can find a clip of him when he was senator saying, the Baltic states, that's kind of a red line. I don't think that's going to be viable. He said that in 1997. And that wasn't like an unusual view in D.C. Absolutely. At the time, that it's like, no, this would probably be something we don't want to be pushing for. But, it's a long story about how eventually they got in. But the main idea is that it was the Baltic states who were pushing for this. It was other NATO members who were close to that region who were pushing for this. Denmark taking a key role in trying to help these countries because they all perceived Russia as potentially being aggressive again. And so it's kind of getting the causality backwards, right? John's argument is that Russia became aggressive because of NATO expanding. But the real story is that these countries expected Russia to become aggressive again and wanted to get into NATO before they did so. Sure. And that is what we're witnessing now is, of course, Russia does not want to invade the Baltic states, is not invading Poland, has been very careful about trying to use military force against them, maybe has used things we call like hybrid measures and so forth, but has been very wary about that. But Ukraine, of course, was not. And so really the question becomes, why was Ukraine not able to get into NATO prior to that? And there's a whole host of reasons. But that's really, to me, the thrust of the argument that I have with John is that it's just simply getting the facts wrong. This was not something that was pushed on these countries by the United States.
Well, to me, it's one of those things where NATO does not have a history of aggression. That's the thing that gets me about this, is that, the idea that NATO membership poses a threat never holds water with me, right? We could talk about Yugoslavia, we could talk about NATO action in Yugoslavia, we can talk about U.S. action in Yugoslavia, but the reality is, of course, any actions that either NATO or the U.S. took in Yugoslavia were after the U.S. and NATO tried to get the greater international community involved, and there was only as a last resort took action. And we can debate the merits of this, but you certainly can't say that the U.S. getting involved in Bosnia or other Balkan states, and I should kick myself because I wrote extensively about this as an undergraduate. That was far short of aggression. And even still, right, we could talk, you were saying, and you alluded to this, before 2014, there were reasons why Ukraine didn't become a member of NATO. Certainly after 2014, so long as Russia holds on to Crimea, Ukraine can't become a member of NATO. I mean, not without sort of essentially going back on the entire sort of NATO charter. Let me talk about this, because I want to talk about your books and the economic costs of war, but let's sort of fast forward. Let's assume that China doesn't get involved, or maybe we do assume China gets involved. Let's say the stalemate continues. The U.S. continues to provide weapons. Russia continues along, sort of just sending, manpower after manpower. How do we break the stalemate? What does this look like? What does peace look like here? And I say this, Paul, because a year ago, I sat through some very frustrating meetings with colleagues in which some of them who didn't understand the circumstances, didn't understand Russia, and frankly didn't understand the history that was involved here, were saying, well, if we want peace, all Ukraine needs to do is give up. And I'm like, okay, so essentially Ukraine becomes a puppet state of Russia. That doesn't help anybody. What does peace look like from here on? How does this conflict end if the stalemate continues? Or does it end?
Well, that's the big question, right? And this really does go to the heart of things, which I think is why it was useful. We started off the conversation with kind of understanding how we got to where we are, because it points to directly the answer to this question, which is that, in my view, right now there is no prospect for a settlement. I expect this to be a long war. I expect this to be a war that, just right now, recently we marked the 1-year anniversary of Russia's invasion. I think next year we're going to be marking the second year as still ongoing. Third year, I think that this is a war that is going to be going on for quite a while, because we are in this stalemate situation that I was mentioning before.
Yeah.
And then that leads to the question of, well, how does it end? When does it end? Does it go on for 8 years? Does it go on for 4 years? Does it go on for 5 years? Right now, we're in a situation where the way to end this is to have an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. But anything that Ukraine could give that would make Russia withdraw, or make Russia say, fine, we're done fighting, anything that Ukraine would give is probably something that is not politically viable for Ukraine.
Right.
Such as, you know what, you can go ahead and have the eastern provinces. Just go ahead and stop fighting. That's not going to work. There's many members, this isn't even Zelensky. I mean, Zelensky himself is very much on board with not doing that, but also many members of the Ukrainian parliament have said, no, that's not an option. Moreover, anything that Russia would give to Ukraine, it's not clear what Russia would be willing to give to Ukraine right now to say, you know what, if you stop fighting, we'll give you this if you stop fighting, right? We will allow you to join NATO. That's fine. But Russia's still going to want something in return. Putin's going to want something in return from a face-saving measure. And so the fact that anything that Ukraine could give Russia right now that would make Russia stop fighting is either not going to be acceptable to Ukraine, or it's not going to be acceptable to Ukraine's supporters. Right? President Biden himself has made very clear that this isn't just about Ukraine. This is also about the precedent of, if you will, rewarding bad behavior.
Absolutely.
Right? That if the U.S. were to support Ukraine in giving up territory to Russia in order to end the fighting now, well, then that sends a very bad message to a China, say, regarding Taiwan, right, as one example. Moreover, it's not clear, going back to what we were just talking about regarding the Budapest Memorandum, it's not clear that Russia would actually commit to any type of agreement short of their maximal goals, right? They might agree to it for a year, 2 years, but any type of agreement that would, say, cede a portion of Ukrainian territory to Russia, but maybe not everything they want, that's simply going to delay, potentially, Russia reigniting the fighting. And that's the other reason why I just don't think we're in a position right now where there's any type of agreement that could be reached that would actually end the fighting.
So let's talk about this. You've literally written the book, The Economics of War. I know you wanted to talk about this. I mean, and it's funny, one of my family friends, Professor Nate Oman at the William & Mary Law School, is teaching a course on financing sovereign debt and talking about the Iraq War. We are pledging huge sums of money, and you know, this is where I get uneasy, of course, you know, because I want to make sure that the money's being spent properly. But let's talk about this. Let's talk about the economics of this. Let's talk about what it means in terms of the debt and how we sort of go on, because we also talk about the politics here at home. And again, I'm someone who is, Russia's the bad actor here. It is Russia's fault this invasion happened. The U.S. needs to be providing support. I've written about putting U.S. troops on the ground. We could debate the wisdom of that. But even I get a little skittish about propping up the Ukrainian economy. But obviously there are circumstances here, especially if we're talking about, you know, I plus 1 year, I plus 2 years, I plus 3 years. So talk about the economics that are at work here.
The economics that are at work, especially the angle of it that you're referring to here, directly intersects with domestic politics in the United States, right? That this is really the concern. So the U.S. is the major economic supporter of Ukraine in terms of military aid, financial aid. The European Union has been stepping up more in that realm of kind of non-military aid in terms of actual dollars being provided. Now, of course, there's been a lot about Leopard tanks and the provision of other arms. But if you look at the figures, if you just look at it from a pure monetary standpoint, and the U.S. by far is the biggest supporter of Ukraine in this regard. And so if the U.S. were to stop, then that would be a huge blow to Ukraine. And so I think that's a big piece of context for this, right? The question becomes that you're highlighting, which is that, well, is that sustainable? And is it sustainable politically? Is it sustainable financially? Is it sustainable economically? So we can think about that. In terms of the financing of it, let's be honest, the amount of money that we're actually giving to Ukraine and the amount of aid we're giving to Ukraine is a drop in the bucket compared to the U.S. budget, compared to the defense budget, right? And so in many ways, you could argue that this is actually, let me put it to you like this. If Russia is one of the major threats facing the United States, which, of course, the Biden administration does view it as one of the major threats facing the United States, and if we're able to keep Ukraine fighting Russia and we're able to support Ukraine against Russia, and that is harming Russia, and we're able to do it at a relatively affordable price relative to the U.S. defense budget, then this is a great financial deal for the United States, right? And again, that's just focusing on the finance of it. But that's one thing to be thinking about with that. There's, of course, though, the political angle to it,
right?
Which is that the political angle to it is to say, well, it doesn't matter if it's a drop in the bucket. It's something that, relative to some other policies, we just don't view as a priority, right? And of course, there's a lot of members of, I wouldn't say a lot, but there is a notable segment of the Republican Party in particular that holds that view. That, yes, if resources were limitless, we would fund this, but they're not. And this seems to be an easy target to be able to point to cut because it doesn't directly affect the American public.
Talking about the politics of it, you know, and I wonder about this, do you think that there would be a greater palatability for all of this if the president were to come and say, you know something, we need to spend this money here, and here's what I'm going to give you. We are also going to flood the international petroleum products market with inexpensive U.S. gas. We're going to massively ramp up domestic oil production here at home. We're going to greenlight new refineries. If the president came to Republicans for that and said, here's the give and take again, right? You know, here's what I'm giving you and here's what you give me. What do you think the appetite? I think there would be an appetite for that if all of a sudden President Biden said we're going to turn on the spigot for oil production and other kinds of cheap energy production. What are your thoughts here? Do you think that might move the needle a little bit?
I think it could. I think, however, there's the reason why I say could is, in particular, the members of the Republican Party that seem most in favor of cutting aid to Ukraine are ones that I think are primarily about trying to do things that undermine the Biden administration.
Sure.
And undermine the Biden administration's policies. So I'm not sure that they would be willing to be in a position to give kind of a win, if you will, to the Biden administration.
It's ironic, right? Because, again, sort of going back to, and I was certainly accused of this when I wrote on the issue in 2014, I was accused of beating up, I just wanted to beat up on the Obama administration for being feckless. Of course, now we know that there are folks who criticize, within the Biden administration who criticize the Obama administration's stance on all of this. What am I leaving out? What are we missing here, Paul, in all of this that I haven't gotten to? Is there anything that we haven't covered?
I mean, we've covered a lot of angles on this. We really have. And, that's the other thing that I think in terms of, this actually dovetails very nicely. Your two questions here dovetail very nicely together. And what I mean by that is, of course, we were just talking about how long is this going to go and how is it going to end? And then, of course, we were just talking about the U.S. domestic politics. Those two things can't be separated from each other, especially from Putin's perspective.
Yeah.
I think a key part of the understanding right now is that Putin's view is that, yes, the war is not going great for Russia. And we're not going to be able to win the war, but we don't have to lose the war unless there is a major political change in the United States.
Matter of timing.
And it's a matter of timing. And I think Putin's view is that there's an hourglass sitting there that is going to run out. And that hourglass is how much is measuring how long it takes for the U.S. to start cutting off aid. And he thinks he can hold out for that.
I am not going to accuse my colleagues and my friends of being duped by Putin, but this is part of the reason why Russia invests so heavily in trying to influence our body politic. Right? And again, if it's inexpensive for us vis-a-vis Russian policy to fund Ukrainian efforts, it's even less expensive for Putin to fund an effort here at home to get involved in the 2016 election and the 2020 election and beyond to gin things in his favor. I mean, I mean, obviously, Putin being I'm going to use the phrase Chekist for those of you who are the uninitiated, someone who's has a background in the Russian secret police and the intelligence services. As a Chekist, Putin views this stuff as part of the statecraft. He's spending a lot of money on or spending a lot of effort. It's not a lot of money, but he's spending effort on this, isn't he?
Yeah, and here's the thing. I'm not sure the effectiveness of Russia's efforts to try to influence our elections, right? I'm actually someone who is much more like, yes, it is true that Russia has tried to do this. I think that's true, and I think we have a lot of evidence. How effective that is another matter.
I'm not even so much talking about elections, Paul. I'm talking about injecting the perspective into the. You're right, and I think back to the Maria Butina affair, and sort of the attempt by Russian intelligence operations to infiltrate American conservative circles. Right? We know that they did this to the left in the 1960s and into the 1970s, the 1950s even, and 60s and into the 70s. We know that they were involved. This was a great new frontier to get involved in conservative circles. All right, listen, before we let you go, because I asked this of all my guests, how did you come to be passionate about these issues? I'm going to ask you about some of your outside interests, but let's talk a little bit about you. How did you come to be interested in this area of the world, these kinds of issues, the economics of war, but all of this?
So I'm glad you asked that question. It's a fun question to answer, especially for students who are always, wondering, like, how'd you get involved in this and so forth. The main way in which I became interested in this area of the world is because of the research I've done on NATO. And the reason why I did a lot of research on NATO was because of my interest in just alliances in general. And so that's a big way in which it's kind of like if you're going to study military alliances, you're eventually going to study NATO. And when it comes to studying NATO, the major policy that NATO's been pursuing for the past 30 years is, of course, expansion into Eastern Europe, right? And so you really need to understand what's happening there. And that was a key part. You mentioned my book, Organizing Democracy. The key case of that book, and indeed the way the book even opens, is about the efforts of the Baltic states to try to join NATO as a way to try to solidify their new democratic systems, right? And I view that having protection from Russia and having NATO membership, that was kind of something that the democratic governments there were hanging their hat on. It's like, this will be a major policy. This will show the power of our regimes if we can achieve these things. So that was something that led me directly into studying this region. But again, it's overall this interest in alliance politics. And of course, the reason why that intersects with the economics of war was because one of the oldest questions regarding economics in military affairs, and by oldest meaning like you can go back, and we're not talking like centuries, but going back to like the 60s, the 50s, was always this question of NATO burden sharing. This is something that has been around for a long time. You know, people talk about President Trump, about how much he would ridicule the Europeans for not spending enough. But that is like one of the most mainstream things that Trump was doing, was ridiculing Europeans for not contributing enough. And that was always something that a lot of economists studied was, well, how much is there not burden sharing in NATO and so on and so forth. So that was kind of how I first started studying alliances, was through the economics of war, understanding burden sharing questions, and that led me into this. So kind of, it's an interesting way to kind of see where one area of research leads you to another area of research, leads you to another one, but they're all connected in that way.
So I ask this of all my guests. I also tee it up in the same way, so I know my listeners they're very familiar with this. So I almost did a podcast called Outside Interest, because I think it's important that people understand that, we are not one-dimensional creatures. We all have things that we do outside of this. So when you're not teaching, when you're not writing, when you're not lecturing, when you're not appearing on podcasts like mine, what are you doing? How do you enjoy yourself outside of your professional field?
Oh, this is fun. This is fun. So yeah, I have a few interests. I mean, first of all, I spend quite a bit of time with my family, and the weekends were always just this past weekend it was snowing, so we went sledding and we go ice skating, those kind of things. Fun. Always fun to do. I'm a big fan of sports. I'm a big fan of college football, NFL. I've always enjoyed those. That's kind of the funny thing.
You went to Michigan, sure.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And also a big fan of movies. I'm looking forward to the Oscars, seeing what happens. I always try to make a point of watching the Oscar movies. What's funny is people, this actually says a lot about my Twitter, in that I always have this impulse of I want to say something about this movie. I want to say something about this sport. But I refrain because I'm that's not what my Twitter's about. However, people who do follow me on Twitter will notice that every once in a while I will weave in movies into what's the 100%. International politics of this movie. One over in December I had about Die Hard. Where's the international politics of Die Hard? I'm
going to share this with you. I cannot, for the life of me, my one of my favorite movies of all time is Charlie Wilson's War, which I know you've seen. I'm sure you've seen. I cannot get my brother and his fiance to watch this movie. And they should be interested in this movie, given their professional fields. I cannot get them to watch. And it's now it's for them, it's a matter of pride. Now they absolutely won't watch the movie. But this is a mistake, isn't it, Professor Poast?
It is. Yes, they should absolutely watch the movie. And I think there's a lot, for me, what I really enjoy about when I point out with movies is I'm a fan of, first of all, there's movies like Charlie Wilson's War, which is actually about some international political event, right? So it's literally international politics part of it. But for me, what's always fun is to think about how movies capture the zeitgeist, if you will. Right?
Absolutely.
And so for me, a recent Twitter thread I did that I enjoyed was I compared the movie Don't Look Up to Armageddon.
Sure.
And these are, of course, the movie Armageddon was made in 1998, and it's also about an asteroid coming to Earth. And then Don't Look Up, which came out last year, was also about an asteroid coming to Earth. They're very different movies, but they also have very different perspectives on the U.S.'s role in solving this problem, and it's fascinating to compare that.
It's funny you say that, because one of the things that I look at is the zeitgeist of the time breeding the villain in a particular movie. So we're talking about loose nukes in Central Europe, and I think of the movie The Peacemaker, which is about a dismantling of an ICBM and the making of a dirty bomb. So I know exactly what you mean. He is Professor Paul Poast, at Prof. Paul Poast on Twitter. Professor Poast, it's always a pleasure. I hope I don't have to wait another year before I talk to you again, though we will have to do this if the war's still going on a year from now. But thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Andrew. Very much enjoyed the conversation.
Always good. This has been yet another episode of The Lunch Hour with Federal Newswire. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy your lunch.
This has been the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast, hosted by Andrew Langer. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.